Developed and published by Capcom, Resident Evil Requiem is the 9th major installment to the Resident Evil franchise, following its successor Resident Evil Village. It is a survival horror and action-adventure game. The hype surrounding this title actually made this entry the most successful in its first week of launch, selling a jaw-dropping 5 million units in 5 days. Resident Evil 9 initially released on the PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, Steam, and Nintendo Switch 2 on the 27th of February 2026. Before I continue, please be advised that there will be spoilers ahead, so watch at your own risk. Without further ado, let's get into the disturbing lore behind Resident Evil Requiem. Set in October 2026, 28 years after the events of the Raccoon City destruction, the game opens inside an FBI office where we are introduced to FBI analyst Grace Ashcroft, who is writing a report on another body found linked to an unidentified disease, until she is interrupted by her boss, who calls her into his office. She enters and gives him an update on a report he previously asked for, that it'll be ready in a couple of days tops, but he stops her right there and says, "Don't worry about that right now." He begins telling her of another body they came across that displays the same symptoms and markings as the other bodies they've been investigating. He follows up saying he needs a good technical analyst on it while pointing at her, signaling he wants her on the case. He gives her a case file to do with the Wrenwood Hotel. She stops for a moment and is silent, until we learn the hotel is where her mother was murdered nearly a decade prior. The boss acknowledges the situation and attempts to give her some encouragement to confront her past. After some time, she slightly nods her head, reluctantly agreeing to take on the case. Grace arrives at Wrenwood and finds the crime scene. She stops and stares at her for a period of time until a police officer notices her presence and gets her attention, telling her it's a restricted area and she can't proceed further. Grace, confused, asks why, before the officer replies saying it's an active crime scene. Grace, snapping back to reality, realizes the situation and shows him her FBI badge. He takes her to the crime scene while asking her questions, but the trauma from past events is coming back to her and she zones out. The officer takes notice and catches her off guard before eventually letting her through. She heads towards the hotel, entering in through the kitchen, reaching a door. But before she enters, she has a moment to herself, wondering if she can really do this or if it's too much for her. But she eventually puts on a brave face and pushes through. The room beyond the door seems to be the hotel bar and lounge, but burnt and in ruin. She finds a picture on the bar which is a photo of herself with the key on the back and a message to meet in room 204. The door she went through to the kitchen immediately shuts and panic sets in for Grace. She begins rummaging through her bag, pulling out a gun, prepared for any incoming attack. But nothing happens, until there's a noise behind her and the situation becomes really intense for her, fearing for her life, trying to figure out what to do. Nevertheless, she continues and heads towards room 204. She heads inside and discovers a bed with a concerning amount of pictures of her and her mother on the bed. She picks up a picture of her on the bed on the laptop when a flashback plays from the events before her mother's death. Her mum walks in home from work and tries to get her off the laptop as it's been a long day, but she refuses. She makes a smart-ass comment to her mum before the phone rings, telling her mum to get it, but because Grace is right next to it, she looks at her and "Come on, really? Wait." Grace frustratingly answers the phone to someone asking for a Miss Ashcroft before immediately hanging up. Grace tells her mother what happened until the lights suddenly go out. Then her mum drops a line impactful enough to raise a few questions. "They're coming." Grace begins asking questions before quickly stopped by her mum and tells her to keep quiet while they attempt to make their way out of the hotel. They end up in the hotel lobby before being greeted by the hotel manager, who apologizes for the power outage and says it doesn't take much to trip it with how old it is. He apologizes once again when he stops briefly for small talk until an assassin puts a bag over his head, suffocating him before slitting his throat, murdering him. Alyssa shoots him a few times before the attacker stumbles into the room next to him. She closes the door, and before they leave, Alyssa hides something behind the massive painting. Grace and Alyssa find another way out when Grace calls the cops. But once she gets off the phone, she begins having a panic attack. While they need to get out, Alyssa prioritizes Grace's health and calms her down. She says all will be explained in due time, and they share a moment of wholesomeness before Alyssa says they need to go. They make their way out until Alyssa is brutally murdered by the same attacker from earlier, until he eventually dies, falling on the table with a bottle of alcohol and a lamp, causing a fire to start. Grace sees her mother's deceased body and begins grieving. We're back in present day and the phone begins ringing. Bit odd for a burnt down hotel, but when she answers, she quickly realizes the sound is coming from the bed, and it turns out to be an old keypad phone ringing. She answers, but no one's on the other end. Grace heads down to the hotel lobby to find out what her mother hid behind the painting, and it turns out to be a diary entry expressing worry for Grace because they keep moving until she notices she's being watched by someone. The bag also contained a disc, which will matter later. Grace is then confronted by the officer from earlier who says something stung him. Shortly after, he loses all feeling in his body and begins to turn. He spits out some teeth before Grace tries to get away, but her jacket sleeve gets caught on a luggage trolley, so she grabs her gun with her free hand, but the officer shoots it out of her hand with a shotgun. Grace dodges the shotgun while getting herself free and grabs the exit key for upstairs, but the turned officer just doesn't quit. So Grace grabs a fire poker and the officer walks right into the poker. Grace is eventually bitten and finally has an opportunity to run, so she races upstairs and unlocks the emergency exit, going through the door, finally getting rid of the officer once and for all. Grace has a moment to herself, wincing in pain from the bites, when she notices a lamp light next to her on and stairs leading to a second floor. Curious, she checks it out. She walks to the door in front of her and is met with the presence of former T-virus researcher Victor Gideon. He calls her the chosen one until he puts her to sleep. However, DSO agents Leon Kennedy and Sherry Birkin, who's on comms, are also investigating the bodies relating to the disease as they're also experiencing symptoms, until Leon is informed of a missing officer last seen where Grace was and arrives in the area to Victor carrying Grace out in public. Victor obviously gets questions from the general public and decides to cause an outbreak in response. Leon goes to check it out, clearing out the outbreak while trying to locate Victor in the process, but sadly has no luck. He believes he's hit a dead end with his location until he's told by Sherry on comms that Victor bought a care center in Rhodes Hill once his old company Umbrella went under, and she suspects him to be there. Grace wakes up in the care center upside down on a gurney tied up. Her blood is being extracted via a needle into a glass bottle, so she knocks down the pole the bottle is on, breaking the bottle and using the sharp end of the broken bottle to cut herself loose. She shimmies from side to side, tipping the gurney over, eventually freeing her legs. To get out of the area, she needs another fuse. She finds a key for one of the doors in a drawer, and inside the room is a lighter along with the other fuse inside a box, needing a tool to open it. She heads into the next room and comes across a book by Harriet Jones called A Shadow Ghost. The whole gist of the book is that the monster, or the ghost, lurks in the shadows and is scared of light. Grace finds a note telling her the tool she needs is inside the nurse's office, so she heads towards the prep room where she's met by a dead zombie. Grace checks his pulse to see if he's still alive, and this is where she meets the Shadow Ghost. She runs down the hallway to the room she escaped from and witnesses the Shadow Ghost burn from exposure to light. She runs back towards the prep room and into the nurse's office, moving the cart over to the cabinet, grabbing the toolbox which contains the screwdriver needed for the fuse. She makes a run for it to the room with the fuse but is stopped in her tracks. She runs away before throwing a glass bottle to distract it and getting past her. She heads into the room and obtains the fuse before being paid another visit from the Shadow Ghost and inserting the fuse, getting her out. Leon arrives at the care center and is met by a nurse who says Victor's been expecting him, which confuses Leon, but nonetheless they go to see Victor, and on the way there, Leon strikes up a conversation with her and learns she's just recently joined the team. She continues on saying he performs experimental therapies at the care center while the facility keeps a low profile due to the sensitive nature of its research. He arrives at the office and is left alone while waiting for Victor until it's discovered he's being watched by a hidden camera. After some time, all of a sudden, an emergency alert is played over the speakers, then the nurse comes in saying something has happened and they need to leave. However, she's snuck up on by one of the doctors who's turned and is wielding a chainsaw, murdering her shortly after. Leon takes care of business and leaves the room. He attempts to track Victor down when he runs into Grace and saves her from the Shadow Ghost. They introduce each other until Victor locks down the care center, separating the two. Leon, assessing the danger of the situation, gives Grace his Requiem. Leon confronts Victor until Victor chokes him out. Grace now has a new objective: escape. But to escape, she needs to solve a puzzle at the front door involving 3 different shaped quartz: a sun, moon, and a star. She enters the office and goes through another door, discovering an area with 2 rooms made out of stone and glass for the window and door. One of the rooms contains a child named Emily who appears to be blind. Grace and Emily talk until an injured man behind Grace briefly wakes up and tells Grace to stay away. He passes away shortly after when she notices he dropped a keycard, which leads to the West Wing. Grace heads through the West Wing and towards the kitchen where she encounters the first big guy in the area, the chef. She has to push a big vat of blood out of the way to get into the next room, which she manages to do successfully. While making her way around the wing and fighting off infected along the way, she stumbles across the room, the chairman's office, which contains a unicorn trinket box that houses a red jeweled gemstone that's to be placed in the door around the corner from the kitchen. Once inside, she finds a severed arm that contains the keycard for the East Wing. But before she can continue, she heads back to the chairman's office and finds a book with a ripped out page along with a pencil in the office. She uses the pencil on the book and makes out the following words: moon, sun, star, moon. She turns the light on and notices a machine in the room with the symbols that the page and door talked about. She inputs the symbols and obtains the first quartz needed for the door, the moon quartz. She puts it in the door and moves on to the East Wing. She enters the hospital area and notices a body on the gurney. It has its chest completely opened up with nothing inside it. She then gets the blood analyzer going before heading upstairs and collecting the wristband needed to access security doors before again encountering Chunk, the second big guy in the area. She runs into the lead researcher's office next to her and finds another puzzle box, but it has a lock on it. A note across from the box says to get the bottle of corrosive from the conference room to melt the lock off. So she heads to the conference room, taking out the infected in the room before collecting the bottle. But when she returns, Victor's in the room. He finally introduces himself and continues regurgitating about how she's the chosen one and is the only one who can release Elpis. When asked why her, he responds saying his master Spencer made her who she is. But then, an alert goes off signaling phase 2 of his experiment is about to begin. He asks Grace a question and in response she runs out and hides from him. He comes out calling out to her but she doesn't move. Eventually Victor leaves the room and she goes back into the office and burns the lock, inputting the symbols of star, sun, moon, sun. Inside the puzzle box is a leather notebook with instructions to open the organ transport box and 4 pages of journal entries by Victor talking about Spencer's research on how a mutated strain of the T-virus can be used for mind control, and of course the moon quartz, which she places at the front door before returning to Emily. After some back and forth, Grace learns there was another person in the room beside Emily named Marie, but she disappeared one day, presumably for further testing before everything kicked off, and Emily expresses happiness that it wasn't her it happened to. Grace leaves the area and heads back to the West Wing past the kitchen, where she enters a room on her left and finds a wrench. She continues down the hall, discovering a garage of some sort, and further down is a truck with a box inside it. The box in question contains an organ. Once she gets it open, she obtains artificial lungs, but then, as she leaves, a bulldozer plows through with an infected driving it. Grace takes care of him, and once the machinery stops, she crawls under, getting herself free. She heads downstairs and uses the wrench in place of the valve that fell off, and when she enters, it turns out to be the cold storage which contains another organ, an artificial heart. She heads back to the East Wing to the hospital where the body is and puts in the lungs along with the heart. The body is resurrected until it eventually dies, and Grace collects the level 2 wristband which is needed to get into the isolation ward. She gets in and heads inside the security manager's office where he's dead at his desk, but there's also a notebook on the desk with the code for the last puzzle box for the last quartz. However, the symbols are too scratched to be made out, but the braille for the symbols are still there, which means Emily is needed. Emily's cell requires a level 3 ID band, and the dead manager is wearing a level 3 ID band, so Grace takes it and heads inside her cell where they finally introduce each other. Grace gets to the point of why she's inside and asks for assistance, to which Emily agrees, so Grace carries her to the puzzle box, but while Emily handles all that, the pair receive company, so Grace takes care of the infected until Emily sorts the puzzle box. Grace returns until the shadow ghost also makes a return and steals Emily. Leon wakes up to being tied up when Victor questions his presence, but Leon is silent, until Victor threatens to experiment on him when Leon fires back with his famous one-liner.
Silent treatment, I hope.
After some back and forth, Victor turns around long enough for Leon to get his hidden blade out, cutting himself free, confronting Victor. However, Leon goes for his gun, which gives Victor time to escape. Leon explores the attic and runs into another chunk before promptly taking care of him. Leon heads down to the care center and finds a room leading to Victor's office, taking care of the infected while exploring in the process. He discovers a lever and pulls it down to reveal a secret elevator, but it gets stuck as usual, so now Leon has to survive while clearing clearing out the infected until the elevator opens properly. He gets in and goes down to discover Victor's office. Leon locks the computer so Sherry obtains the IP address and finds some very concerning files relating to the T-virus and the symptoms they're having with the link to the T-virus mutation strain. However, more documents show up, and one in particular is an email from a redacted source to the White House Chief of Staff referring to a single word: Elpis. But then a picture of Grace pops up, which confuses Leon. Grace makes her way through the underground of the care center and discovers a secret underground lab, before entering the security room and finding Emily laying down on a bed inside a cell. Grace makes her way around when she comes across the Shadow Ghost again and sees Emily for herself. In order to get Emily out, Grace needs to unlock the cells, and in order to do that, she needs 3 joint plugs. One is in front of her and another is by a forklift. She heads to the collection pool but needs a tool to open the box. So she heads back to the center of the underground towards the boiler room where she finds a square socket wrench. She heads back to the collection pool, opens the box and inserts the plugs, making her way through to the final plug. But she can't just take it. She finds a forklift key and moves the one in front of her first, revealing a room with a floor plan that turning the valve will drain the pool. With that, she heads back to the first forklift and activates that, inserting the plug and making her way to the other side, turning the valve, surviving the processing timer before finally retrieving the final plug and sliding down a blood slide to get out. She heads back to the main terminal for the plugs, inserting them and pulling the lever which opens all the doors, where she quickly runs to Emily's cell and gets her out via the elevator. But while they try to escape, the Shadow Ghost is not having it and tries all that she can to get to Emily, but when they reach surface level, the Shadow Ghost attempts to drag away Grace, but the elevator cord doesn't hold up enough, slicing the Shadow Ghost's hand clean off. During everything that happened, Emily managed to keep the last quartz safe and gave it to Grace. She takes Emily to the front door, inputting the final quartz, and they finally get out. They escape via the courtyard when Grace stumbles upon a helipad. The pilot for the helicopter is still around, but Grace gets sus when he walks towards them. However, he claims it to be an old war wound. Grace then learns the pilot got the key taken from him by the boss. He then sees an opportunity to make her a deal. He'll fly them out if Grace gets the key, since his wound won't allow him to survive against the infected. Emily gets scared, but Grace tries to keep her calm when the pilot tells her he can keep Emily safe while Grace grabs the key. So Grace puts it in the chopper and begins searching for the key. She comes across a room that has objects which contain 2 different types of double helix models, with a secret contraption in the middle of the room to insert the models into. Once the right one is inserted, she begins descending and ends up in a secret underground facility, presumably government affiliated. She heads downstairs into a room with multiple chambers containing humans that seem to be experimented on and extracting their blood. She heads upstairs into the control room and picks up the helicopter key, but the doors are locked, so she unlocks them. She leaves the room to hear Victor talking to someone on the phone called Zeno, and he confirms the results from Grace's testing confirm she's the one they've been searching for.
I've done it.
The building ends up in a self-destruct sequence and everything is disconnected, so once Grace heads back downstairs, all the infected come out of the capsules, while Grace makes a run for it, escaping the facility. She manages to make it to the helicopter, but the horde that escaped the capsules continues to close in. The pilot has to wait for the helicopter to warm up before taking off, but the infected climb up on the helicopter trying to smash the window, until the helicopter finally takes off, but the infected manage to successfully break the window and attack the pilot, which causes Grace to have to take over until she crashes it, killing the pilot in the process. She checks on Emily and she doesn't seem to be doing too hot. Leon witnesses the helicopter crash and protects Grace while she tries to get into the church. Leon enters the church to Grace trying to keep Emily alive, until Leon directs her to the water treatment plant once they hear company arriving. Leon deals with the company while Grace makes her way to the surface of the treatment plant. She gets to the surface when the Shadow Ghost makes an appearance again. She lays Emily down to rest, and to finally get rid of the Shadow Ghost once and for all, Grace needs to open the roof hatch by getting the 3 different power sources running again. So she heads down and gets to the first one while being chased, then heads into another room to grab a crank to restart the second one, and last but not least, she heads to the last one where the crank is stuck and has to distract the Shadow Ghost to get it unstuck in time. She heads back up, distracts the Shadow Ghost and gets rid of her once and for all. Grace returns to Emily to find she sadly didn't make it. She attempts CPR but to no avail. It seemed like all hope was lost until...
Ellie, hi, it's me, I'm right here.
However, she's not awake because she's alive. As Emily swings at Grace, Leon comes in protecting her, but Grace didn't like that one bit. Leon continues putting bullets into her while Grace pleads to Leon until Emily eventually goes down. Grace begins grieving and blames herself for Emily's death. Leon understands what Grace is saying, but they need to keep moving, until Grace responds by giving back Leon's gun he gave her at the start. Leon starts coughing up blood while Grace takes a bit of a walk to process everything, but then Victor makes an appearance at the top of the stairs waiting for Grace, continuing on regurgitating about Elpis. Victor opens the door to reveal someone outside. This someone is Zeno, a high-ranking member of a crime syndicate called the Connections. He blames her for the destruction of Raccoon City, but is also the key to building a brave new world, with her being the final piece. Sherry takes her medication before taking her glove off, exposing the T-virus growing on her hand. She returns to Leon on comms, who tells him they were told by higher-ups to shut down the investigation into Elpis, so now they have no choice but to continue in the shadows, making them rogue operatives. Leon arrives in Raccoon City with a new objective: get to the city center. He begins exploring and comes face to face with the beast that took over the city in the aftermath of its destruction. Leon is thrown around a bit until he's eventually left alone, but comes across normal sized spiders and takes care of them before coming face to face with a giant beast once again and takes it down. He makes his way through the abandoned train station, getting above ground again in front of the city center, but it seems like someone else was there before him trying to get in, and there's no other way in since the army corps set up a tall building to seal off the city and the wall goes on for miles, so the only way in is through it, and to get through it he needs to set off the detonator, but it's missing parts. 3 to be exact: a signal receiver, a distributor, and a relay. Leon discovers a BSAA camp and realizes it was them trying to get into the city center before him. Shortly after, he's informed by Sherry that the Pentagon erased any record of the government themselves, ordering a missile strike on Raccoon City. However, shortly after, we learn it was Zeno who ordered the DSO to stand down from their investigation, and because he failed at succeeding with it, he passes the torch to Victor. Leon goes through a warehouse, clearing out the infected before grabbing the key to the apartment blocks. He heads to the rooftop and obtains the first part for the detonator, the distributor, which passes signal and power through to the other parts connected. Leon checks his surroundings and discovers where the relay is and the signal receiver. Leon takes the elevator down and opens the door with the key. He heads downstairs into the parking garage where he finds an infected and a power box with missing fuses, along with a note detailing where to find them. Leon heads to his left, clearing out the infected before finding the first fuse. He then heads to his right towards the sewerage plant, clearing out the infected, one of them slightly annoying, but nonetheless he grabs the last fuse before heading back out to the parking garage, inserting them and getting out. Heading outside, he runs into a pile of dead soldiers, one of which he grabs the helmet cam from and plugs it into his phone to extract the footage from it. And from the footage, they had orders to rendezvous with the advanced party at the Raccoon City Center before heading for Ark, with their ultimate objective being to retrieve Elpis. But once they get outside, the soldiers start getting killed one by one. Once the last soldier is left alive, we can see who committed the brutal murders. In the meantime, Zeno continues escorting Grace to the city center. Before Leon leaves, he obtains a BSAA container key. He heads towards the gas station trying to get some fuel, but of course has some infected to deal with, even having a chainsaw battle with one. Once they're dealt with, he finally gets some gas and gets himself out of the area. He goes through the apartment blocks, clearing out the infected military officers, explosively as well, before collecting the next detonator part, the signal receiver. But it's broken and he'll need a repair kit to repair it. He's still able to combine it with the distributor though. Leon gives Sherry an update, while she gives one back, stating she found evidence of the Pentagon putting pressure on the BSAA, but it seems they had internal disputes, so the BSAA started moving independently. Leon heads back to the first BSAA camp he found and opens the container, revealing a motorbike and the repair kit. He uses the repair kit to fix the signal receiver, which leaves just one more component to go: the relay. He heads back through the warehouse, heading upstairs, using the fuel to get through, and rides the zipline to the next area. The rundown building is full of rubble, so getting through required meleeing, shooting, and a bit of parkour. He eventually finds an elevator door he's able to pry open and jumps down to 2 rusted old train carriages he's able to avoid. Then he slides down to a surface with glass. This area contains a bunch of infected military officers, so once he clears them out, he shoots the glass holding an object, preventing him from going up. More infected show up before he deals with them, then he finally makes it to the other end where he finds the final part for the detonator, the relay. With the parts combined, he now has a completed detonator to use on the gate. He checks his surroundings and discovers a rundown platform that somehow still works that'll get him down. Leon heads to one side, clearing out the infected before getting one side of the platform down, before heading to the other side and clearing out the infected before getting the last side of the platform down. He gets on, activating the platform and begins descending. However, the platform all of a sudden struggles and becomes stuck, leaving Leon vulnerable to the infected. But of course, he deals with them before finally descending again. It stops again, and after some time, the cords on the platform start to break, causing the platform to fall straight down, but its landing causes the platform to start sliding off into the big hole in the middle. Leon turns around to a horde in the sewers and quickly gets out of there. He returns to the gate and blows it up, but to get through all that rubble and debris, he'll need something. During Leon's joyride, Victor spots him and attempts to put a stop to him, but fails, until he unleashes infected dogs on him. After some time dealing with the dogs, he finds Victor again, but he destroys a building, stopping Leon from continuing. Leon goes a long way, returning to Victor, while he deals with both him and the infected dogs, before destroying another building on him again. Now it's time for arguably the best part of the whole game. Leon and Victor reunite with one another once again, while Victor shoots a rocket at Leon and fails, until Leon retaliates, throwing an axe at his bike, which does some damage. Victor then attempts to retaliate again by shooting Leon but misses all his shots, which pisses him off, so he pumps the brakes and tries to grab Leon by the neck, but Leon escapes his hold before riding away to the other end. Now it's a good old-fashioned duel. They ride toward each other and Leon shoots his bike, causing it to catch fire and explode at the end of the road, with Victor going with it. With Victor taken care of, it was time to explore the city center. Leon stumbles across what seems to be the RPD, or at least what's left of it anyway. And as he gets inside, he gets flashbacks of his first time inside the RPD. Venturing a little further into the police station, he discovers a BSAA HQ, along with someone who seems to have been expecting him. He picks up a note that reads, "You can't save anyone," before the computer in front of him turns on and Zeno appears on camera along with Grace. To get to Grace, he's gonna need a mechanic jack. So he shoots the ladder to get upstairs and enters the library, finding the jack on the ground, using it to open the door where Grace is. Leon makes his way through, finding the room where Zeno and Grace are. He listens on Grace and Zeno's conversation where he explains Elpis is the key to human mind control. At least he believes it to be anyway. And because of all the eyes on Raccoon City once the outbreak happened, they couldn't take any chances of it being stolen, so they ordered a missile strike to hide the supposed virus. Grace calls it extreme when Zeno responds saying, "Is it? They had the president assassinated when he tried to investigate." Again mentioning she's the key to the virus before showing a picture of Emily. However, Emily is just one of many children that were experimented on to create a duplicate of Grace, but every single one failed. Zeno clicks to a camera showing a clone of Grace in a bed. This turns out to be an orphanage in Raccoon City back in February of 1990. She wakes up to a bunch of commotion outside the room. Basically, the experiments they did on the children went wrong and now they can't control them, leading to them going rogue. She checks the bed next to her to see if they're awake, but no one's there. No one's in the room at all, which freaks her out a little. She exits her room and wanders down the hall, peeking into the room with the door half open, and witnesses a bunch of children surrounding a doctor with red eyes and surgical scars around their heads, signaling their brain has been tampered with. The doctor panics and shoots the kids, but because what the kids were injected with, one of the benefits is regenerative health, which is basically immortality, so they can't die. And because of that, they close in on the doctor and snap his neck. She calls out to them, but they instantly turn their heads and start heading over to her, causing her to run back to the room and hide under the bed. The kids come into the room and check each bed for her, but don't succeed, so they leave the room, producing a creepy giggle while doing so. She leaves the room once again, entering the room the kids were in, and finds another doctor murdered, before continuing on to the next room, heading down the stairs, trying to get into the next room, but the door doesn't open, so she hides under a table when the children fall from the top floor and regenerate their health, with one of them entering through the door she's trying to get into. She goes through the door, but the two kids are standing there, so she heads back to the hiding spot and after some time, goes back in. With the coast clear, she enters the next room and finds a key to the hatch. She collects it and heads to the hatch, hatch, but the kids enter the room, causing her to hide behind some boxes. After nearly being caught, the kids are distracted by something and eventually leave the room, giving her the opportunity to go down the hatch. She explores the basement, going down a series of stairs before ending up in a church. She heads to the front when the wall opens, revealing a logo of none other than Umbrella. She pulls down a lever which opens a door to the next room and pulls out a casket to climb up and over the gate to collect the fire poker. She gets out, but as she does, the kids enter the church until more wake up in the caskets behind her, giving her no choice but to make a run for it. She pulls the ladder down and climbs up into what seems to be the Umbrella facility. She enters the room inside the lab, going through a slideshow until she stumbles upon a picture of herself. The doctor walks in and we find out this Grace clone is named Chloe. However, it's not long until he injects her with a T-virus, but immediately calls for her death once she immediately starts showing symptoms. Zeno says they were never able to recreate Spencer's key, but it didn't matter now because they have the original, Grace, and tries to persuade her to unlock Elpis at Ark. Grace begins blaming herself again for her mother's death and for what Emily turned into, but Zeno tries to keep her on topic and tells her what's done is done, with the focus being on the future. But then, Grace asks herself a very good and important question.
Was she even really my mother?
Grace starts having flashbacks and reaches a point where she just screams, until Leon comes in saving Grace, but she just ends up sadly collapsing. Leon attempts to shoot Zeno, but the man just dodges all the shots. Zeno says he's been expecting Leon and brings back an old friend to play with Leon, Mr. X. He is chased throughout the second floor until he eventually loses him. Leon now has a new objective: make his way to the orphanage, which is how he'll get into Ark. Leon escapes RPD and enters a building, staring at a door before having a flashback of Robert Kendo and his infected daughter. He opens the door to find a skull on the ground and has another flashback of Kendo refusing to kill his daughter. Leon has a moment of empathy and promises to never let it happen again. Leon continues on until Mr. X makes an appearance again, throwing a missile at him. They fight until Leon finally takes him down once and for all. He makes it to the orphanage, or what's left of it anyway, and heads underground, continuing through the abandoned train station, finding an abandoned train before coming across the flesh-eating plant and taking it down, when the train falls and crashes at the bottom. Leon explores and finds a rappel left behind by the BSAA and rappels down into the abyss of the flesh-eating plants. He takes them down before getting to the giant plant and blowing it up. Leon gets to the entrance of Ark and opens the door. After a 5-minute opening sequence, he finally gets in and notices supplies from familiar companies. After a bit of exploring, he comes across a security room, and after clicking through some cameras, he finds a camera with Zeno and Grace. He links the camera number to the area they're in, Pandora, which is the central refining system. But on the camera next to them, Leon sees a few elite guards coming towards him and takes them out. He heads into the next room and deals with more of them before reinforcements arrive, taking care of them as well. Leon continues on and reaches an area where he comes face to face with a commander. He's very skilled in close quarters combat, so once Leon pushes him through the glass and the commander takes Leon with him, it becomes a parry only fight until he's finally taken down. Leon heads into the room that the commander came out of and finds the pair. Zeno begins to explain that there's already technology to control others' will, but it's not efficient at infecting others with it, and he believes Elpis solves that problem. But then, he comes clean and admits him and his team were the ones who hit Raccoon City to save Elpis for themselves, and has been there the whole time waiting. Elpis requires a password, and if the wrong one is entered, Ark is destroyed and Elpis is lost forever. So he asks Grace for the password, but of course she doesn't know it. Zeno refuses to believe it and continues on until Leon shows up. Leon shoots at Zeno again and of course dodges every shot until Leon finally slices his arm when Leon is elbowed. Then we see Zeno regenerate health from his nearly sliced off arm, making him immortal. However, Leon doesn't give up. He continues fighting, but Zeno's just too strong. Just as Zeno's about to finish Leon off, Grace threatens to offer herself if he kills Leon, and while Zeno's distracted, Leon takes that window of opportunity to shoot a robotic arm, causing destruction, and grabbing Grace, grabbing onto the falling arm to get off the platform. They slide their way down and land on a metal platform. They end up heading out towards the dump and get off, but once Leon gets off, he sadly collapses. After some time, Leon finally wakes up. She asks about the marks on his body and he says he's got a stage 3 T-virus infection. She follows up asking why would he come here if he was so sick. Leon responds reflecting on how everything started in Raccoon City for him and he couldn't do much then, but he's here now to change that. He asks Grace about the password, but she has no idea about it. She helps Leon up when he says he's going to destroy Elpis. Grace wants to tag along, but Leon refuses. Grace doesn't want any more regrets after everything that's happened though, so she says whatever it takes, count me in. Until Leon asks her to promise she'll end it all if anything happens to him. She accepts and they begin exploring the dump. They find a door, but the crane's blocking the entrance. They find an entrance with Grace offering to go, asking for a boost, getting inside the area. She goes through an air vent, stomping out the filter before jumping down and arriving at the control room. But the system is locked and she needs an override key to activate it again. So she heads upstairs into one of the rooms and encounters Alyssa, a blind infected but could still hear, along with normal infected in the area. She cautiously goes through the area, entering a room with the override key and grabbing it while making a run for it back to the control room, inserting the key which turns on the lights and lifts the crane, allowing Leon to explore the other side. Grace grabs the magnetic key and heads into the next room where there's another puzzle she's got to solve to get into the final room, which involves 2 spheres. She heads to the first area that has the sphere, and while dodging lickers and normal infected, she reaches the room upstairs that contains the Nobilis orb and places it at the door before heading back to the area she got the override key from, opening the door and retrieving the last sphere, the Animus orb. She places it at the door before it opens and she enters through, interacting with the console when the floppy disk comes out. Confused but familiarized, she realizes she has the other disc from her mother and puts that disc in, revealing a file with a bunch of videos on it. The first video highlighted is The Creator, to which she hits play on, and the video that plays is an interview between Alyssa and the creator of Elpis, Spencer. But before he reveals any groundbreaking information, he takes a break. But then, Grace discovers a video in the file named Grace. Back to Leon, Sherry hears Leon in pain and checks in, but he's all good and wants to settle this once and for all, requesting a chopper for immediate evac. Leon makes his way up and through the corridor when he begins experiencing the last legs of the T-virus before it completely consumes him. He heads upstairs and discovers an elevator, but it's shut down due to a security threat and needs an override key to get it working again. So he heads downstairs where he encounters more lickers and normally infected taking care of the lot, activating the control panel to reveal a hidden room with another control panel, revealing a hidden path, making his way through and getting the override key, making his way back to the elevator, but it's crawling with lickers, so he takes care of them explosively. However, once he tries to reactivate the elevator, it loses control of the pods and it releases the infected, who Leon takes care of until the elevator finally arrives and he heads up. He pushes through along the corridor while coughing up his lungs, with the T-virus almost completely consuming him. Back with Grace, she finally checks out the video titled Her Name, and it's a continued interview between Spencer and Alyssa where he acknowledges his research unleashing disaster into the world until Alyssa mentions Elpis, claiming it to be a form of hope, which Spencer agrees on blindly. Spencer begins talking about his feelings, saying he's plagued by guilt and comes to the realization that happiness can't be achieved at the expense of others. Shortly after, he is brought a child who he claims to be completely normal, and he adopted her, calling it his hope. Shortly after, again, Alyssa realizes why Spencer accepted the interview when Spencer asks if she wants to hold the child. She accepts and learns her name to be Grace. Grace, trying to process everything she just saw, sees Leon in pain before he passes out once again and goes to save him. Grace gets Leon awake and she helps him to the central platform where Elpis is. Grace says she doesn't know the code when Leon encourages her to purposely enter in the wrong one to destroy Elpis, but Grace has an idea. Leon trusts her and they come face to face with Zeno again when Grace says she'll enter the password if he lets Leon live. He accepts and she chooses to release Elpis, putting in the password Hope. Once the password is put in, the machine activates and Elpis is released. Zeno wastes no time injecting himself with it though, thinking it's going to make him stronger than he already is, until Grace gives him a warning that Elpis isn't what you think it is, continuing on that there's nothing special about her and she was never any key. Zeno responds confused because Grace released Elpis, but then demands to know what it is before attacking Grace. Leon musters enough energy to attack Zeno and get him off her, and that's when she says,
Elpis is Spencer's atonement. It's an antiviral.
Meaning Zeno is no longer immortal. However, Victor makes a surprising appearance after being blown up earlier and praises Spencer for his genius. Zeno begins throwing accusations at Victor that his research was all wrong and that all that key talk for Elpis was fake. But Victor responds saying Spencer's paper was incomplete. There was never any connection between Grace and Emily. Until Victor and Zeno go back and forth, with Victor praising the fact that all bioweapons will be useless and will disrupt the New World Order. But Zeno wants the bioweapons, he wants the weapons of mass destruction, he wants the New World Order to succeed. Until Victor realizes Spencer gave them anarchy and vows to bring his vision to life. But Zeno laughs in response and says Spencer defied them all and paid the price with his life. He is nothing. Victor quickly fires back, calling him an imitation. But then Zeno denounces their affiliation until Victor responds by decapitating him. Grace tries to protect Elpis from Victor, but then he injures her, and while Grace was down, he injected Elpis into Leon, curing him of his T-virus infection. Victor grabs a vial of Elpis and interacts with the keypad before the platform begins collapsing and they fall, with Leon jumping off, but there's no sign of Grace. However, that thought quickly fades with the appearance of Victor. Leon battles Victor until he reaches his final form. Leon shoots his weak spots 2 times over before being grabbed by Victor, escaping his hold and running up his body, taking his axe to his weak spot and just going to town on it before something finally happens. But he's not completely dead yet. However, Leon makes sure he finally bloody is while giving Victor the coup de grace with his Requiem. After some time, he realizes Grace still isn't around and Sherry isn't answering comms until he finds Grace on the ground unconscious and gets her awake. Shortly after, the underground begins collapsing and they accept they're going to be stuck down there with Leon staying by her side. But then, a bright light appears with ropes dropping down and soldiers rappelling down. It's the BSAA agent set to rescue them by Chris Redfield. Once they're safely out, Leon talks with Sherry, telling her she's next to be cured. Leon sees Grace by the chopper and heads over to her, reflecting on what just happened until Grace mentions Emily, but then Leon says this.
Grace, I didn't hit any of her vitals. She could still be alive.
A news report then plays of the bioweapons lab discovered, leading to a massive scandal and investigations reopened into certain parties. But as usual, the government denies everything that happened, and for the cherry on top, Emily is rescued and saved. Back at the FBI office, Grace is back at work where she seems to be on the phone to Leon, catching up with him. Back at the underground of the Ark Labs, a final message is sent.
Retrieving the objective before they send in the wolves.
With the main story out of the way, it's time to get into some things that happened in the story and figure out why the things that happened. So if you weren't paying attention to cutscenes or dialogue, you probably feel so lost with the ending and what it meant. To sum it up, Zeno and Victor are pretty much morons. Before Spencer passed, Spencer was doing research on creating an antiviral named Elpis, but because his research was never finished and not properly documented, the parties involved all assumed Elpis was another bioweapon to continue the New World Order from the government, and because Spencer repented from all the heinous shit he did that caused all the destruction in the first place, he adopted a girl named Grace, but she was a perfectly normal child whom he injected with Elpis so she was immune to the T-virus, and we know this because she was bitten at the start of the game and never turned. And because she was affiliated with Spencer even though it's not his actual daughter, Zeno and Victor assumed Grace was special because of the Spencer affiliation, hence why Grace's mum was apprehended and murdered. So they could kidnap Grace and have her put in the password, but she didn't know it because she wasn't special, she figured it out based off the video she watched. And so with them assuming the worst of Elpis, that's why Zeno didn't hesitate to take it, because he was under the impression that it was going to make him stronger than he already is, considering he's already bloody immortal. This is also why Victor says Grace and Emily aren't related, because they're not. One was born normal and the other is a clone of the one that was born normal. Because they couldn't get their hands on Grace and had already done experiments on Grace which led to a match for the virus, they began experimenting on children to successfully recreate another Grace and use the blood to transfer the memory over for mind control purposes and have the clone unlock Elpis and release it. Some pretty dark stuff. And the experiments that failed were killed and put in body bags, which we can see in the basement of the care center, who were then dumped into the pool of blood before being grinded up. So again, if you didn't pay attention to dialogue or cutscenes, you're probably lost on who or what this name is or means. Basically, Marie is another little girl who was with Emily, being experimented on by the evil doctors. They were both medicated, which turned them blind, except Marie was experimented on with a blood sample first, as referred to this document here. But she didn't react well to the blood, instead it turned into a massive monster vampire. And because of this fail, referring to this note here, they started an operation to eliminate her because she was out of control. It's also why you may have noticed that whenever the monster interacts with Emily or takes her, she never hurts her intentionally. I'll get to why in a little bit. You probably encountered a chunk in your first playthrough as Grace and didn't kill him like I did, and encountered him again as Leon, then killed him the second time as Grace, but he still appeared for Leon. Why? This is because those chunks are brothers. From a report found here, 2 brothers, Thomas and Timothy Jackson, got surgery on their brains to suppress their satiety, which means they would then eat everything they could get their hands on and are never satisfied, therefore gaining weight. And that's exactly what happened, hence the 2 chunks. They are an international crime syndicate responsible for creating and selling bioweapons, one of them being E001 or Evelyn from Resident Evil 7. They are a very conspicuous group with very little known about them for good reason. However, they have hidden operatives that worked for them, one being Mia Winters from Resident Evil 7, Zeno, and of course Victor. They also have deep ties to, of course, the US government, a pharmaceutical company, Tricell, the family, and 4 houses. They were also behind the destruction of Raccoon City and the bankruptcy of Umbrella, leading to them seizing their assets. Umbrella, or Umbrella Corporation, were a multinational conglomerate with subsidiaries in a variety of industries. Subsidiary meaning another company in that industry but still controlled by Umbrella, and their main subsidiaries consisted of medicine and pharmaceuticals, but really it acted as a front for covering up the illegal activities like the creation of the T-virus. The true purpose of Umbrella wasn't to monopolize and capitalize on a profitable industry, but more eugenics, which is the process of evolving human evolution. So they funded a project for it, the Wesker Project. The Wesker Project, or Project W, was a project pioneered by Spencer to advance the human race, as he wanted to achieve immortality and live on through the next generation of humans, and he believed this was done through blood. This is why in the orphanage the children were experimented on. This was Spencer trying to figure out the memory transfer through blood, but after hundreds of failed test subjects and an eventual betrayal by the connections, he ultimately gave up on the ideology because it was unsuccessful. And so following the betrayal, he stopped visiting the orphanage and went on a path of atonement, going as deep as to adopt a child that would be named Grace and left in the care of Alyssa upon his death according to his will. Now, the future of Umbrella would be destroyed with the destruction of Raccoon City from the connections to hide Elpis for themselves and take away everything Umbrella had and take it for their own good. Spencer, or Oswald Earl Spencer, was a British billionaire that was born into a family of powerful elites and had everything passed down to him from his parents. Spencer was the CEO and founder of Umbrella Pharmaceuticals. Now, he had an ambition for a new world order as he saw the current world state as destructive, and he wanted to lead that new world order, which meant he wanted immortality, and Spencer believed this was achieved through memory transfer, through blood, hence the blood experiments. However, the origins of this stems from 1967 when Umbrella was founded along with his virology circle, Dr. Edward Ashford and Dr. James Marcus, because the Spencer Foundation wasn't able to properly fund Dr. Marcus's research, and so Spencer suggested getting into the pharmaceutical industry, therefore birthing Umbrella. Later on, before the 70s hit, Spencer would meet another scientist sharing the same eugenics ideals as him, Dr. Albert Wesker. Before we get into the progenitor virus and another project made for it, let's get into those origins. Back in 1966, a year before the founding of Umbrella, Spencer remembered an event in West Africa to do with a tribe called the Endopaya. They're an ethnic group that inhabit West Africa. This tribe held rituals involving a magical flower that granted great power to those who could survive its poison. Dr. Marcus began hypothesizing that a virus could be naturally produced by the flower and mutate the consumer. The group, learning of this hypothesis, liked it, but they didn't know if it actually existed. So Dr. Marcus and his protege Brandon Bailey went on an expedition to West Africa. Spencer's involvement is not confirmed, but they discovered the virus actually exists. So with that, and with Spencer meeting Wesker, who shared the same ideologies, actually formed a project called the Wesker Project. The whole goal of this project was immortality, but to get there, they had to do testing. So they began abducting children who were smarter than the average human and gave them the best education money can buy before they entered adulthood, then infecting them if they were what they were looking for. But with Umbrella established, this is where things would take a dark turn. Spencer became increasingly paranoid that his New World Order project would be threatened by his friends. And to keep funding going for the eugenics project, Umbrella and the US military made a deal that the military will continue funding it if they can create bioweapons using the T-virus. After basically a whole decade in 1977, Wesker was hired into Umbrella and was to abuse Dr. Marcus's trust so he could steal his research for Spencer. Another decade later, in 1988, Dr. Marcus was gunned down and had more of his research stolen for Spencer's benefit. By the time the 2000s rolled around, this is when Umbrella would see the end of their existence. Wesker would betray Spencer and give all the research data to a rival company, while the T-virus would spread and cause anarchy to the city before being destroyed by the US president. However, we know this information to be false. Umbrella would be held responsible and the Raccoon trials would begin, and of course, Wesker would be the reason for Umbrella's bankruptcy by presenting evidence in court against Umbrella. The BSAA, or Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, are an international counter-terrorism organization started by Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield. They're a private military company with the purpose of tackling the rise of mutant bioweapons and have been on multiple operations, including the Baker House incident in 2017 and the Village Massacre in 2021. Following Chris losing trust in the company, a new elite task would be formed under the direction of Chris Redfield, the Hound Wolf Squad. As for the Ark incident, the BSAA had some internal disputes which led to the North American branch to move independently before their murder by Xeno. DSO, or Division of Security Operations, is an American-led anti-bioterrorism agency that was founded by Adam Benford in 2011 until his assassination because he was the president at the time and threatened to leak everything about Umbrella. Sherry and Leon were employed since its founding in 2011. So you probably encountered some infected that were in certain clothing and would repeat certain lines over and over, or even a singing infected. This is due to the blood experiments. While they were experimenting trying to replicate Grace, and while they were failures, they still seemed to retain some sort of personality and not completely turning. So that's why you see the maid in the bathroom still cleaning even while infected, a guy in a suit roaming the halls who's sensitive to light, a doctor who still tries to do surgery, and a singing woman in a white dress. However, the singing women are a little different. This is caused by main character syndrome, which is when you perceive yourself as the main character to your life story and everyone else is just a side quest, basically attention seeking. At the end of the game, Grace finishes her report on everything that happened in Raccoon City, and we find out what really happened. Everything that was explained in Spencer's section stays the same, but new and slightly changed details are revealed here. For example, Spencer had a roadmap for his research at Ark. Step 1 was to concentrate funding into the Wesker project and the T-Virus, which leads into Step 2, the establishment of Ark as a central command center, following into Step 3, the development of Elpis, then Step 4, the transfer of memory and forced evolution. More new information shows Dr. Marcus was sent a donation by a puppet organization of the Connections, the F Foundation, a whopping $30 million. But since then, the F Foundation ceases to exist. Remember when I briefly mentioned Brandon Bailey, who was Marcus's protege in Spencer's section? Well, there's an email from him sent to the F Foundation awaiting a response from someone. There was a rumor that he was the founder of the Connections, but this turned out to be false and was possibly only a small cog in a giant machine, with the Connections having run the criminal underworld for decades. There was a time period Spencer had complete control of Umbrella, but there were moles working for the Connections employed to Umbrella leaking information, and they grew their ties to the government so exponentially that Spencer was losing control over his company's power. Yet after everything, he was still able to protect and complete his research, Elpis. Elpis was developed as a last hope for all the bad shit he did. Because of all the betrayals he suffered, it was created as a middle finger to everyone who betrayed him, as it's an antiviral designed to combat against the bioweapons, which is the opposite of what Xeno wanted. But no one knew this at the time. All they knew was that Elpis had the power to upset the military balance of the world, and that honestly could mean anything with how vague it is, so the elites took it as a stronger virus and bioweapon. Now we get to the Raccoon City destruction. We already know the Connections were behind it from what Xeno said, but further documents explain why they did it. It was implied the missile strike was to contain the spread, but it was not. A plan was formed to burn the bridge between the government and Umbrella, shifting all the blame for the criminal activities on Spencer. Then a message was sent from the Connections to the government telling them to send the missile strike. The goal behind this was to seize Umbrella's assets, with the Connections taking control over the Ark facility and having Elpis to themselves, thinking they're going to be staying ahead of the arms race. And then the trials happened, where we find out Wesker was linked to another organization called Tricell, which had strong ties to the Connections. Then because Ark was now in the hands of the Connections, it was used as a testing center for bioweapons. Elpis was created to combat the bioweapons, but since learning everything about Spencer, it's making me think, was he really sorry for everything, or was he only sorry because he couldn't accomplish his goal of immortality and a lot of lives were lost because of it? What would have happened if he succeeded even with the betrayals? Did he accept death was inevitable, therefore acknowledging his wrongdoing and turning over a new leaf? I guess we'll never know. Grace asked this question when she was with Xeno, and I honestly had a feeling she wasn't, just based off how these games usually go, and it was good to know I was right. She's not. Spencer adopted Grace before his inevitable death and accepted Alyssa's request for an interview so she could see Grace and have her, since Spencer left Grace in her care according to Spencer's will. So if you're just as confused as Alyssa as to why he barely did an interview but he was kind of adamant on making sure Alyssa saw and held Grace, that's why. Because she was affiliated with Spencer, so she had to be, even though she was a perfectly normal child. She had a blood test done, which you can see at the lab, and she's a match for every blood type, which coincidentally makes her the chosen one, but it seems she was just born that way. She never knew the password either, she just guessed from the video. This is also why they had blood experiments going down in the lab to recreate Grace, and why the children were also being experimented on in the orphanage. Man, this is the deepest I've ever dived in regard to lore for a game. This game was truly something. There was quite a bit to go through and dissect, so if you made it this far, I appreciate you for making it this far. If you have any of your own theories that weren't mentioned in this video that you want to share, feel free to leave it in the comments. But other than that, this was fun, and if you want more Resident Evil lore content like this, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you're new, and I will see you legends in the next one. Peace.